Iaido is an offshoot of Kendo, a traditional martial art of Japan. Kendo, though its origin lay in fighting by use of real swords, nowadays is played between two contestants with bamboo sticks, shinai, whereas Iai is played singly with either a real sword or an imitation. What is Iai then? Iai is an art of self-defense in which you draw the sword immediately against an enemy's sudden attack to win at the very moment when the sword leaves the sheath. It was initiated about 400 years ago and has been followed by many Kendo players ever since. Its training or practice is very hard because the purpose of Iai is to ultimately master the secret to defeat your enemy without drawing the sword. In other words, to spiritually conquer your opponent with your sword left in the sheath. Therefore, you may settle problems without resorting to arms. Take the keito shise or formal standing position, sword in your left hand, and advance to the embu or practice position. Transfer the sword to your right hand and bow to the shinza. Transfer the sword to your left hand. Spread out the hakama gently from left to right with your right hand and kneel in place, first the left knee, then the right. The shinza should be to your upper left. Place the sword on the floor sideways before you so that the edge of the blade is turned outward. Focus your mind on the sword and bow towards it. You are now one with the sword. Grasp the sword with your right hand, placing your thumb on the tsuba. At the same time, with your left hand, lightly pick up the sword near the kojiri and secure the sword in your sash to assume the position of seiza taito, the formal sitting position with the sword in the sash. Focus all your attention on a point on the floor about 4 or 5 meters ahead, as if you're looking out over a distant hill. And now for a demonstration of the basic forms in slow motion. 1本目、前. Your opponent is sitting facing you. When you sense that he's about to attack, draw the sword and cleave his temple. Follow immediately with a downstroke. Rise and at the same time bring the sword up. Arc the blade down and outward to perform the chiburi action, shaking the blood off the blade. Align your rear foot with the front and then draw your right foot back. Extend your right elbow and replace the blade in the saya. At the same time, lower your rear knee to the floor. Rise and simultaneously align the rear foot with the front and assume the taito shise. Let's look at the main points of 1本目. When striking your opponent's temple, make sure that the saya is pushed way backward. Bring the sword up close to your left ear and over your head, as if to thrust to the rear. The sword should be parallel to the floor. On completion of the downstroke, the kissaki is slightly lowered. At the end of the chiburi action, the kissaki is pointing downwards at an angle of about 45 degrees. 2本目、後ろ. An adversary is sitting behind you. When you sense he's about to attack, seize the initiative by turning and cleave his temple. Follow with a downstroke. Rise and bring the sword up, arc the blade down and outward in the chiburi action. Let's look at the main points of Nihonme. Draw the sword while turning. Cleave your opponent's temple as soon as you face him. The foot movement is the reverse of Ipponme. Sanbonme, ukenagashi. When an adversary sitting at your left attacks suddenly, deflect his blow while rising and deal a slanting downwards counterstroke. Open the right hand and re-grip the tsuka with the same hand, palm downwards using a backhand grip, and replace the sword in the saya. At the same time, lower your rear knee to the floor. Let's look at the main points of Sanbonme. Turn to the attacker and draw the sword over your head to protect the body. Draw your left foot back and deal a slanting downward stroke. Stop your left fist at the navel. The kisaki should only be slightly lowered. Let's look at Sanbonme again. Yonhonme, tsuka-ate. You are sitting in Iaihiza facing an opponent with another adversary behind you. When you sense their intention to attack, strike the front opponent in the solar plexus with a tsuka. Draw your sword and pierce the rear opponent in the solar plexus. Then strike the front attacker with a downstroke. Let's look at the main points of Yonhonme. Strike the adversary precisely in the solar plexus with a tsukagashira. Hold on to the koiguchi with your left hand and bring it towards your navel. Extend the right elbow and thrust the opponent behind you. Withdraw the blade and raise the sword high above your head. Face the front and deliver the downstroke. Replace the blade in the saya. At the same time, draw the right foot back to the left and take the sonkyo position with the left knee on the floor. Gohonme, kesagiri. You're advancing when suddenly an adversary attacks from the fore. Strike upwards at an angle. Execute a return diagonal downstroke. Take the hasso position for zanshin. And now for a look at the main points of Gohonme. When striking your opponent with an upward diagonal stroke, your right fist should come up slightly above your right shoulder. Take the hasso position for zanshin. Grasp the koiguchi with the left hand and simultaneously arc the blade down and outward to perform chiburi. Ropponme, morotezuki. You're advancing when suddenly you sense an attack by 3 adversaries from the front and rear. First, cleave the right-hand side of the front opponent's face and deliver a double-handed thrust to his solar plexus. Turn fully to face the rear opponent and deliver a downstroke. Turn and face the third opponent coming at you from the front and execute a downstroke. Perform chiburi to the right and return the sword to the saya, maintaining the same position. Let's look at the main points of ropponme. When striking the right-hand side of the front opponent's face, cleave down to his chin. Let's look at the action from the front. Lower the sword to chudan and firmly pierce his solar plexus. Withdraw the sword, turn and raise the sword over your head in the warding off style. Nanahonme, sanpou giri. You're advancing when you sense an attack from the front, right and left. Cleave the right opponent and deliver a downstroke to the left opponent. Follow with a downstroke to the front. Draw your right foot back and assume the zanshin position by morote hidari jodan. Arc the sword down and outward to perform chiburi. And now look at the main points. When striking the right opponent, cleave down to his chin. Turn and face the left and immediately follow with a downstroke. Turning to the front enemy, raise the sword in ukenagashi and execute a downstroke. At the end, your sword should be parallel to the ground. Let's take a close look at the sword path. First, strike your right opponent on the head. Observe how the path is different from that of ropponme. In ropponme, the blade cuts diagonally from the right. Whereas in nanahonme, it cuts straight down from the top. When turning, make sure to turn on your toes. And now look at nanahonme, the 3-directional cut performed at normal speed. Hachihonme, ganmen ate. You're advancing when you sense an attack from the front and rear. Thrust the tsuka into the front opponent's face. Turn and pierce the rear opponent in the solar plexus, and then turn to the front to deliver a downstroke. Let's look at the main points of hachihonme. Step forward with your right foot and at the same time thrust your entire sword, saya and all, into your opponent's face and strike him fiercely between the eyes with the tsukagashira. When piercing the solar plexus of your rear opponent, make sure that your right fist is properly positioned above your right hip and thrust immediately. 9本目 soete zuki. While advancing, you sense an attack. Seize the initiative and execute a diagonal downstroke from the right. Pierce your opponent's stomach, supporting the blade with your left hand. Without moving your left hand, withdraw the blade and take up a stance with the blade lowered, indicating zanshin. Draw back your left foot and swing your sword outward for chiburi. Without changing position, replace the sword in the saya. Let's look at the main points. After executing the diagonal downstroke from the left, your right fist should be level with your navel, with the kisaki slightly higher than the fist. When piercing, place the center of the blade firmly between the thumb and index finger of your left hand. Your right fist should be above your right hip. From this position, pierce with the left hand supporting the blade. When indicating zanshin, be sure that your right elbow is extended and that your right fist is as high as your right breast. 10本目、四方切り. While advancing, you sense you are surrounded by opponents on 4 sides. Seize the initiative and use the tsuka to strike the right fist of the upper right opponent as he's just about to draw his sword. As soon as you draw your sword by sayabiki, turn your upper body counterclockwise to pierce the solar plexus of the second opponent behind you to your left. Then perform a downstroke each to the first opponent in front of you to the right, then the third one behind you to the right, and the fourth to your upper left. Draw back your right foot and assume the morote hidari jodan for zanshin. Arc your sword down and outward in chiburi. The main points of 10本目. When striking with the tsuka, hit hard and accurately with the flat of the tsuka. After drawing the sword, press the mune or ridge of the monouchi against your left breast. Your right hand should not be close to your body. When piercing, bring your left hand towards your navel while continuing to hold on to the koiguchi. At the same time, tuck your elbows in. Assume the wakigamae position with the sword lowered at your side and then raise it overhead. Let's take a look at 10本目 at normal speed. This shows how to hold the blade. Grip the tsuka softly with your right hand near the tsuba and your left hand near the tsukagashira, but make sure that your little finger doesn't go over the makidome. Hold the sword securely with the last 2 fingers of both hands and relax the other fingers. Grip the tsuka lightly as if it were an egg, making sure the entire palm is touching. And now watch how to exit from the dojo after practice. Sit in the correct position, remove the sword from your sash, first halfway with your left hand, then completely with your right hand, and set it upright in front of your right knee. Lay it down quietly to the left with the edge facing inwards so that it's now lying across in front of you. Bow to the sword and then stand it up in front of you in the center with the edge facing inwards. Slide your left hand down near the kojiri and pick it up. Hold the sword in your left hand and stand up, aligning your rear foot with the front. Assume the formal standing position, sword in the left hand. Transfer the sword to your right hand and bow to the shinza. Transfer the sword to your left and assume the formal standing position once again. Step back a couple of steps starting with your left foot, turn clockwise and exit. "1本目、前." When striking at the adversary's temple, the kisaki is too low. The kisaki should only be slightly lower than your right shoulder. When you raise the sword overhead, the fists and kisaki are too low. Here's the correct way. When holding the sword aloft, make sure that the wrist is turned slightly inwards and the blade is raised close to the left ear as if to thrust to the rear. Compare the incorrect form with the correct one on the right. There, the kisaki is too low. Slightly tighten the hold of the little finger of your left hand, bend both elbows, and raise the sword over your head so that the kisaki is parallel to the floor. On completion of the downstroke, the kisaki is parallel with the floor. On completion of the downstroke, your left fist should be level with your navel. The kisaki is slightly lowered. On completion of chiburi, the kisaki is too high. The right fist should be level with the left, and the kisaki points down at an angle of about 45 degrees. "2本目、後ろ." The sword is drawn after you've turned to face your opponent. This is too late. It's important to strike as soon as you face your opponent. At the time of cleaving, the rear foot is not in parallel to the front foot. The rear foot should line parallel to the right foot. "3本目、受け流し." Many people tend to display a rather unsteady stance. Distribute your weight evenly on both feet to steady your balance. On completion of the downstroke, the kisaki is too low. When executed correctly, the left hand should stop at the navel with the kisaki slightly lowered. "4本目、tsuka ate." When the opponent is struck, the tsukagashira is too high. The tsukagashira should be aimed at your opponent's solar plexus. Let's take another look from the side. This is the correct position. At the time of striking, the rear foot is not in parallel to the right foot. The rear foot should lie in parallel to the right foot. When piercing the rear adversary, the upper body is unsteady. Be careful not to turn too far. Extend your right elbow and bring your right fist close to your body. This is a bad example of not thrusting to the rear firmly enough. Turn the kisaki slightly inwards and thrust firmly. 5本目、けさ切り。When cleaving your opponent with an upward diagonal stroke, don't lean forward. Steady yourself and strike upward at an acute angle. Be careful not to lose balance of the upper body. There should be no pause between the upper diagonal stroke and the downstroke. Execute both strokes in one continuous movement. Study the correct form and be sure not to pause between strokes. "6本目、もろ手突き」。Drawing the sword and cleaving are two separate actions. As soon as the blade leaves the saya, its kisaki strikes the opponent. Let's take another look from the side. When drawing the sword, you tend to erroneously turn the upper body too far. Turn the upper body and maintain a steady stance. When thrusting at the solar plexus, the kisaki is too high. Thrust as if you are pressing down the kisaki. "7本目、三方切り」。Drawing and cleaving must be one continuous action. Here the sword is once raised above the head before a downstroke. This is not a vertical stroke. Draw and strike almost simultaneously. Make sure the kisaki is firm. Notice the position of the kisaki on delivering a downstroke. Here the kisaki is too low on delivering strokes to the left and front opponents. The left fist should be level with the navel, and the sword should be parallel to the floor. 8本目、顔面当て。When striking the face with the tsukagashira is too low. The tsukagashira should hit precisely between the eyes. When turning to face your rear opponent, make sure that your feet are in parallel. Open the right heel so that you are directly facing the enemy. When piercing the rear opponent's solar plexus, it's easy to make the mistake of lowering the sword so that it's parallel to the ground. The kisaki should be pointing at the opponent's solar plexus. Bring your right fist in so that it's slightly lower than the kisaki. 9本目、添え手突き。When drawing the sword and cleaving, be sure to do it in one continuous movement. Make sure that the kisaki does not lose its speed. Draw and go straight on to the cleaving action. When piercing the adversary's stomach, make sure that the kisaki is not too high. The sword should be level with your hips and parallel to the ground. 10本目、四方切り。When surrounded by opponents on 4 sides, it's no use performing each stroke accurately if the action is not continuous. Let's look at the correct way. The strokes are precise, the action continuous, and there's a sense of rhythm to the movement. When piercing the enemy behind you to your left, be sure not to bend the elbow in this manner. Turn halfway, straighten the elbow, and pierce. Let's review the whole procedure from entering the dojo to leaving the dojo. Advance the embu or practice position, transfer the sword to the right hand, and bow to the shinza. Transfer the sword to the left hand, turn so that the shinza is to your upper left, spread the hakama gently from left to right with your right hand, and kneel in place, the left knee first. Place the sword sideways in front of you so that the edge of this blade is turned outward. Focus your mind on the sword and bow towards it. Pick up the sword with both hands and secure it in your sash. Let's look at a model example of Iai, a combination of proper state of mind, precise sword technique, and correct form. Ippon me, mae. Draw the sword completely. Stamp the right foot forward and simultaneously cleave your opponent's temple. Raise the sword above the head as if to thrust to the rear, and follow immediately with a downstroke. For the next practice, take 2 to 3 small steps backward to the right position. Turn clockwise and sit formally in seiza fashion with your back to the shinza. Nihonme, ushiro. Turn counterclockwise, pivoting on the right knee. Strike your enemy's temple the moment you face him. The foot movement is different from ipponme. Turn right and sit in seiza to prepare for the next form. Sanbonme, ukenagashi. Draw your sword upward and deflect the adversary's blow. At the same time, turn your upper body slightly towards him to protect your body. Follow with a slanting downward stroke from the left shoulder. Release the right hand and re-grip the tsuka palm down using a backhand grip and replace the sword in the saya. At the same time, lower your rear knee to the floor. Yonhonme, tsuka ate. Watch how the tsuka is aimed correctly at the front opponent's solar plexus, how the right elbow extended when piercing the rear enemy, and how the downstroke is executed. Gohonme, kesagiri. Strike upwards at an angle and without pausing, execute a return diagonal downstroke. Draw the right foot back and assume the hasso position to show your zanshin. Draw the left foot back and simultaneously arc the blade from your center downward into chiburi and replace the sword in the saya. Ropponme, morotezuki. The main points are cleave down to the chin, pierce the solar plexus from the two-down position, and withdraw the sword and turn, watching the rear opponent as you raise the sword over your head from your left side. Nanahonme, sanpogiri. When drawing your sword and striking your enemy on the right, cleave down to his chin. Turn and face the left, immediately following with a downstroke. Hachihonme, 顔面当て. Strike the adversary firmly between the eyes with the tsukagashira. Turn and pierce the rear opponent in the solar plexus, and then turn counterclockwise to deliver a downstroke to the front. Nine 本目、添え手突き. Watch how the hand supports the blade and how it's thrust into your opponent's stomach. Ten 本目、四方切り. When striking with the tsuka, hit hard and accurately with the flat of the tsuka. When piercing, both elbows should be tucked in. After finishing the embu, sit and remove the sword from your sash. Stand it up in front of your right knee with the blade facing inwards. Lay it down quietly to the left so that it's now lying across in front of you. Bow to the sword and then stand it up in the center in front of you. Slide your left hand down from the middle of the saya and pick it up. Stand and at the same time align your rear foot with the front to assume the formal standing position, sword in hand. Bow to the shinza. Transfer the sword to your left hand and assume the formal standing position again. Step back a couple of steps, starting with your left foot, turn clockwise and exit. When practicing Iai, remember the importance of a proper state of mind, accurate sword technique, and correct form. In other words, try to achieve unity of mind, sword, and body, and practice as if you are facing a real enemy.